You know what? As well, I don't know if you guys caught up with it. I know I finally caught the Talking Scared interview he did with Stephen King last year, and he actually Molly Thing of Evil does appear on the podcast, and it is so fucking delightful. Like even Stephen fucking King gets interrupted by his dog on the fucking podcast. It's just like, okay, I'm never going to feel bad about it again. You know?
Yeah, it's the great leveler.
But it's good enough for him, man.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I aspire to Neil's greatness for getting Stephen King in the first place.
Oh
so
my
cool.
God.
So fucking cool.
Jesus, I would love to. I mean, he is just the man, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah.
He's going back on there too.
No, he is. He's going back this year. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear him talk about the new short story collection, because last time when he went on last year, it hadn't come out yet. Obviously, it's out now, so I'd be very interested to hear what they've got to say about it.
Yeah, I'm gonna get on. I've got it right here. Actually, I'm gonna have a go at that very, very soon, because I'm reading a lot at the moment, but I'm very excited by that.
Well,
his short stories are bloody brilliant lately.
If it helps, I mean, not that you need the encouragement, but I got almost 4,000 words of essay out of the short story collection, which will be going over to the gym in the next week or two. It fucking blew my mind.
Really? Yeah, that good? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the best things he's put in years, I think.
I agree. I agree. And there's a couple of the stories in it that are absolutely perfect. I think, like, genuinely perfect. I mean, I go on about it in the essay and the reasons why, but there's the one about I can't remember the guy's name, but it's the bad dream. This guy's bad dream, and that is.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the best things he's ever written. Full stop. I think it's a classic King premise where you can see it, you can feel the contours of it. Like he just had the idea and he just chases the rabbit all the fucking way. And we know, like, every now and then the landing's not super smooth, right? We've seen that once or twice. I mean, The Outsider is always the one I come back to, where it's one of the best opening premises of anything, and I just, does it land?
Yeah.
But this one, holy fucking shit. And it's partly, I think it is partly the length, because it's novelette / short novella length.
Mm-hmm.
It's as long as it needs to be, and not a single word longer. Anyway, I think it's like pretty much a perfect story, and that's one of maybe 3, I would say, or 4 in the collection that I think are on that level, and there isn't anything resembling a bad story in there.
No, it's all good.
It's because you have that stuff, and then at the other end of the spectrum you have shit that it felt like it could have been written for Night Shift. He's got a couple in there. It's just like, holy shit, like it's proper old school.
Yeah. Wonderful. I can't wait. I'm so looking forward to it. And I mean, King I always find very refreshing when I come back to him anyway. There's just something about his writing that is very familiar and very comforting, regardless of the subject matter.
Absolutely.
It reminds me of being a kid. It does. It reminds me of reading this stuff for the first time, getting those books off my mom's shelf, and reading this stuff for the first time. Being able to read the adult horror books for the first time, as a kid. Mm-hmm. That's what it sparked in my mind. That's what I got when I reread The Mist for our last conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Just heady nostalgia, really strong feelings of childhood. And that's what I often get from King.
Yeah, me too. Oh, sorry, go on, Kayleigh.
Oh, I was just gonna say the same. It takes me back to, like, childhood a little bit, because I just remember my first reading experiences for King.
Yeah.
And just feeling like, oh my God, an author I love.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because he already had like legendary status in my mind, because my mum loved him so much, and she would tell me about his work and whatnot. So when I actually came to read him, it was like, wow, it was already built up in my head who this guy is. I'd seen some of the films already as well, obviously, because you just do, don't you? If you're a kid of the 80s, you just were exposed to them. They were around, right?
Langoliers?
Love it. It's so bad.
Hell,
I fucking love it. The 1990s series of the Langoliers is so good.
Tell you what, you two can do that fucking podcast.
Yeah.
I'll be in the audience happily for that. I don't need to.
Honestly, I am so up for that, Kayleigh.
I listen to you two talk about it, but I ain't watching it again.
It is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life, but its badness is brilliant. I mean, I can't. The kit value
Kit, quite frankly, how are you not terrified of the Rice Krispie sound?
That's the weird part. I think it does kind of work in the book, but
yeah.
I don't know, man. I mean, I say this, by the way, as an unapologetic kind of, die-hard fan of Maximum Overdrive. I mean, I'll die in a ditch over that fucking movie, which is also terrible, but I love. But yeah, no, Langoliers is not for me. But I mean, what you're saying about King as comfort is absolutely. I mean, I write about this in the essay, but I'm coming up on the first anniversary of my dad passing away, and it's no coincidence that I'm on a massive Stephen King jag and a massive Bruce Springsteen jag, right? Because they're comfort artists to me. They're artists that were connected with my dad, that he was a fan of, I was a fan of, that we enjoyed together, and of course, I'm drawn back to that. I mean, I've been reading, I read Night Shift. I've been reading through Everything's Eventual at the moment. Obviously, you like it. You like it darker. I just finished. And I blasted through Finders Keepers again, which I remember loving, and then I remember everyone saying, "Oh, it's not that good because it's not really, like Hodges is barely in a butt." And I read it again. I was like, "No, you're all idiots. It's a fucking masterpiece." Finders Keepers, absolute fucking. Yeah, me too. It's flawless. It's fucking brilliant. The pace, the again, it's the way that the stories just interlock and interweave, and the way he builds dread, because you can see these elements on a collision course and you're not sure how it's going to work out. Fucking, it's just so good. And it's also just about loving literature and loving books, and which he's been very unapologetic about in his old age, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been great. But the other thing is, one of the reasons I read Night Shift is I wanted to see which of the stories in Night Shift I thought might be suitable for kiddo, because obviously she's 14 now and she's wanted. Sorry, yeah. So I've marked off. 14. Yeah, I know. Life comes at you fast, my friend.
Yeah. I thought you said life comes out of you fast.
I mean, that too. As we're going to cover in the story we're going to talk about in a minute, but we'll get to that. But yeah, I went through with a bunch of post-it notes and just said, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, label, and it's so cool. I was just talking to her just before I came in to record, and I was like, I remembered what she was reading last night, and as I was sort of, saying night to her because I'm coming out to record, and she'll be in bed by the time I go, and I just whispered in her ear, I was like, "Have you finished Quitters Inc. yet?" And she was like, "Yeah, it was brilliant."
That's such a good age. It's such a good age.
So good,
she is now primed for this stuff.
No, she's ready for it. I mean, she read The Institute. That was her first King novel, and she adored it. I mean, she was just like, "Oh my god!"
Wow.
So yeah, I'm just giving her a grand. I think I might even give her Fairy Tale next. It's a bit weird. It's a bit of a slow start, but I think she might enjoy Fairy Tale.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. We'll see.
I mean, it's funny. I'm also reading a fairy tale, but it's the one by Raymond E. Feist from that same era.
Yes.
From miles back,
Slightly different vibe.
It's a bit different. Yeah, it's a wee bit different. It is a little bit different. I mean, I remember enjoying it as a kid.
Sure.
It's interesting rereading it.
Yeah.
It's very of its era. It's very of its era, actually. I mean, the thing I'm actually really enjoying about it is the way it's like a window into how writers were writing at that time.
Absolutely.
It's so 80s. Oh my god, it's so middle white America 80s. Yeah. It's a rich family. They always fucking are, aren't they? 2.4 children. It's about a writer. They always fucking are. Everybody's rich. Everybody's like the daughter character Gabby is like an heiress, and she has money and horses, and it's you can't write like this now. You can't write horror like this now. You can't. Yeah. If you had characters like that as your protagonist, people would be like, "Fuck them. I hope they all fucking die. I hope they'll burn in a fire. I hope the fairies get them."
Yeah. It's true. We have developed stronger cultural faculties, haven't we, over the last 20 years? But yeah, it's funny you say, because I always bang out on about that one. I always bang about James Herbert's The Rats and that school. I think it is a decent horror novel, but as a piece of social history, it's fucking unparalleled. You want to know what it was like working class London in the 70s? Read the fucking Rats. That's the real deal. For good and ill, but that's what it was like, and that's what attitudes were like. And some of the attitudes in it are ugly, but it's real.
Sorry. As a very, very subtle segue into what we're
go for it.
I mean, this evening we have, I think, one of the most brilliant stories in this entire collection, in the entirety of the Books of Blood. And it's largely because of exactly that quality, Kit. It's because of its social commentary and its awareness.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always felt this about it, but rereading it this time, it slapped me in the face. Like, it's a big old feminist slap to the face, isn't it? This one? Jacqueline Ess, Her Will and Testament from the Books of Blood. It is Clive Barker's feminist manifesto, isn't it?
I think it probably is. It's this is my first time, as ever. It's my first time reading it, and actually my first time reading it today, because my life is just fucking insane at the moment.
You're quite busy at the moment, aren't you?
A little bit, yeah. Maybe after we finish recording, I'll fill you in on some of that shit. But yeah, I mean, it's been nuts. So yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get to it ahead of time. But it is just it really is extraordinary. I mean, it's interesting in the sense that I do think that. And I don't know if this is true or not, but it feels actually to me to also be very influential.
Yes.
One of the things about reading this collection as a whole, but this story it hit me particularly acutely, is I'm in retrospect starting to understand a bit better some of the and I don't mean this as any insult to the work I've been reading recently, incidentally, but I am starting now to understand the lineage of some of the mind-blowing queer horror that's been coming out in the last sort of 5-10 years, and again, I'm taking nothing away from the artists that are producing here and now in 2024, because they are producing amazing work and they are doing different things, taking it in all kinds of different directions. But it's that thing of, like, I was thinking about it in musical terms. Like, I remember as a kid being, obviously being a massive Guns N' Roses fan when I was 11, and I remember when I was 15 hearing the Sex Pistols' Pretty Vacant and hearing that guitar sound and thinking, oh, okay, so Slash didn't actually invent that. Yeah, he did his own thing with it, and he took it and he's a better guitar player than Sting. But you know what I mean? Like, it didn't come out, like, it didn't come down from tablets of stone and got handed to Guns N' Roses. They're part of a lineage. They're part of a, and it takes nothing away from either band or artist to point that out. It's just, it is what it is, right? And that's what
Absolutely.
I got that really strongly off of this. I thought back again over. I was particularly actually thinking of Paula the Ashes. We Are Here to Hurt Each Other, which I mean, we've rhapsodized about that. I think all three of us have rhapsodized about what a fucking mind-blowing collection that is.
When I read that for the first time, I saw one of the most sincere, like, descendants of Barker in terms of literature that I have ever seen, in terms of the themes that he talks about, the imagery that he utilizes. And again, this is taking nothing away from Paula. I think Paula would be very happy to say this herself, having spoken to her.
Yeah.
But you can see that she has been influenced by stories like this, by the Books of Blood, and has taken them and made them into her own. She's like myself. She's a sincere student of Barker.
I would also say, though, it's like what I feel is like this story. It feels to me like this story is the most clear example yet of Barker opening a door through which a parade of incredibly talented writers in their own, with their own ability and their own things to say, have just carried it forward in a multitude of, like, really interesting ways. But yeah, that's why I really do want to ask.
Opening the door, he's kind of like ramming it open, isn't he? He's like trashing.
Well, yeah, opening, kicking the door down and then setting fire to it. Yeah, because it's Clive and we love him. That's what he does. Kayleigh, I've really got to ask though. So, obviously, you've chosen to come on this show to talk about this story particularly.
Yes.
What's your? I was curious, because am I right that you're in a similar? Have you recently read Books of Blood, or are you reading them at the moment? You're in a similar spot to me on this one. I can't remember.
I've read Books of Blood, but only like last year.
Right.
And
okay.
Reread the story for today. So I only started reading Clive Barker last year, though, and I was so angry that no one had put the Clive Barker book in my hands before.
Yeah, right.
Because I thought, well, what the fuck, guys? Like, surrounded by people who read, and no one said you have to read Clive Barker. But yeah, sorry, I forgot that I wasn't just listening to this podcast for a minute. I was gonna say, like, the influence. More and more recently, when I've been reviewing books for Happy Goat Horror, I've noticed an uptake in sort of Barker-esque themes and no one can really sort of describe like the visceral bloody scenes like him, but I've noticed more writers like going with that style. And I don't know if this is probably like a massive coincidence, but 9 out of 10 times when I say, oh, there's like a Barker-esque feel to this, it's a book written by a woman for some reason.
Yeah.
And I've read some, and then I was, when I reread this story earlier today, I was thinking about The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins
Gilman. Yeah.
And I felt like this has shades of that. Like it's
Totally.
So when you said about like the lineage of these kinds of stories and this kind of horror, that I was, a line just was drawn in my head when you said that.
It's just so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I was reading it and I was thinking of Priya Sharma, and I was thinking of Georgina Bruce, and I was thinking of Penny Jones and Laura Marrow, and all of the, all of the writers, and not just the women writers, but also the queer writers who have come about in the wake of Barker. And I was thinking, like, he is well regarded. There's no doubt. He is regarded as one of like the big patron saints of horror fiction. There is no doubt. But I still don't think people understand what he did. I still don't think people understand how he ripped those locked gates off of their hinges for the rest of us to walk through.
Yeah.
Nobody was writing fiction like this. Nobody was writing horror fiction like Jacqueline Ess or Will and Testament in the 1980s. Feminist horror from an underclass queer writer, it just didn't exist. It did not exist in mainstream fiction, and certainly not in this shape. Certainly not like this.
And yes, underclass queer, also white man, and I think that's significant too, because I think one of the things that's interesting is when I think about the 80s horror boom, and I do think, I mean, I would say this, I'm a fanboy. I do think King's an exception to this, but I think when you look at a lot of the other, frankly, less talented writers that came in his wake a lot of the time and were trying to imitate what he did, I think one of the very fair criticisms of it, that a lot of them fell into the kind of, and I'm talking about the male writers here, fell into that kind of Garth Marenghi trap when it came to writing women. Like, a lot of them weren't, I think, terribly good. There were plenty of honorable exceptions, right? But there were also enough that the joke with Marenghi lands, because it has that ring of truth to it, right? Like, we can all think of examples.
Sometimes, if you go back and try to read some, and I won't be mean enough to name them, but some of the writers who were riding that wave of horror that King basically created almost single-handedly, when it comes to them writing female, like women, just writing women, full stop, of any age, by the way, it is that risible. You can see where Garth Marenghi comes from. You can see what Garth Marenghi is riffing on, their conception of what it means to be a woman in the cultures they're describing are just, it's non-existent. It's almost non-existent. It's very male gazy. It's very idealized. Or it's the other way, and it's misogynist and awful. There's no middle ground.
Really amusing.
No,
if you choose to find it funny, it's really funny.
It can be. I mean, it can be when you go back. It can be really amusing to read now. Then you've got this.
Yeah. Well, this is that. Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
Right. And Jacqueline, what an amazing character. First of all, she's not anybody, and I love that. This is something that you'll see. It's almost like the prototype for a kind of character you're going to find in Barker's fiction going forward. This archetype of the woman occurs again and again and again in his fiction, and she's nobody. She's not rich. She's not particularly smart. She doesn't have any grand ambitions or anything to that effect. She is just a woman in a working class household in the 1980s UK, right?
Yeah.
And her power doesn't come from anywhere. There's no explanation for it. And I love the fact he resists that. But the power is not bestowed upon her. Because, if there was an explanation, that's what would happen, right? It would have to be bestowed somehow. It would have to be some quirk. It would have to be some accident. Her power comes, interestingly, from her frustration with her circumstances. It comes from her defiance of patriarchy and the men who are around her. That's what sparks it.
Yeah, I love how like the first instance of it when she's with the doctor who's being really dismissive of what's just happened, and he's like, "Oh, we'll give you some. I suppose you'd like some sleep, would you, and some sedatives?" And it's so funny. Well, actually, it's not funny. It's sad that I related to that doctor's appointment. 50 years later or 40 years later or whatever. I I was once told that I had appendicitis when I was telling the doctor, but I don't have an appendix.
Fuck's sake.
And that's what they went with for 12 hours.
Wow.
That was probably a more severe circumstance, but like that is so ridiculous. And I really liked when she's just thinking like she wants him to be a woman then, and I think it was just, like try and think like a woman or have some empathy or something, and then obviously it gets quite literal. But I thought that like what actually happens is quite fitting of the cis female experience in a lot of ways, because it's real violence and bloody and everything when he starts when his body starts changing and everything. And I just thought, like, I don't know if it's because I'm demented, but I laughed a little bit.
I think you're meant. No, I think you're meant to.
Yeah.
I do think you're meant to. I mean, it earns the title A Book of Blood, doesn't it? I mean, like, it is really graphic, and he goes for it. He loves describing what's happening here. The anatomical detail is unbelievable, but there's something about like the overwrougtness of it, and also the way Jacqueline regards it. I mean, yeah, she's kind of horrified because she's not experienced it before, but at the same time there's a detachment, and she doesn't stop either. She doesn't withdraw. It's like, no, be a woman, experience it, understand
Yeah.
And how many, I mean, it's almost in a way it's a kind of anti-patriarchal power fantasy, isn't it? It's like he's almost appealing to his female readers and saying, how often have you been in a situation with a man, not just a doctor but any man, and they're talking over you, they're telling you what you think, they're telling you what you should feel and what you should want, and all you want them to do is shut up and fucking understand.
Yeah, like if you actually listen to the person speaking, it's not that hard to understand someone if you actually listen to the words they're saying.
Right. And it's just amazing that you've got this, ostensibly a white male writer who does seem to understand this experience, and it does relate wider to his experience of the world. I mean, again, I often say this in these conversations, but I do think it has a great deal to do with his circumstances as a gay man, obviously, because he is kind of... Sorry, Kayleigh, go on.
I was just agreeing with you.
He does understand to a certain degree as a result of his experiences. And again, you've got to kind of dislocate your mind from what the experience of a gay man in 2024 is to the experience of a gay man in the 1980s, in the 1980s UK, in the underclass of London. He will have seen every stripe of misogyny, and in a way that we may not have. He will have seen it in every institution. He will have seen it in every relationship. I know that he's spoken quite openly about how he was surrounded in his early life by these amazing women, his aunts and his mother, who did everything. They did everything for their male counterparts. They looked after them. They did the shopping. They did the cleaning. They paid the bills. They cooked their food. They did everything for them, and were treated either dismissively or terribly for the most part.
I saw, this is it's going to sound like sort of left field this comment. I was watching a Theo Von podcast. Don't know if you know Theo Von, but they was arguing with someone about it was some dick, I can't remember his name now, but he was saying about how things got harder because women wanted the vote and they wanted the right to work, and now there's all these divorces and da. And Theo One was like, well, yeah, but if women had the better end of the deal, they wouldn't have fought for the right to work and earn their own money, would they? Like, clearly something was going wrong. Women weren't being treated like the equals they were if the preference would be, right, I need to earn my own money, own my own property, and have the same, like, you know, it wasn't a cushy scenario for a lot of people that set up. Otherwise they wouldn't have needed to be any change.
Exactly. And you know, it's so interesting. What I also like about this story, I mean, Barker refuted simplicity, and I love that about him. This is true of almost every story in this collection. So the male characters in this are really interesting. In one way, you can look at them as being objectified in the way that female characters often are in horror fiction. You know, they're often in this story sex objects, or they are victims, which is really interesting. That's part of the satire of this story. But there are all of these little subtle details where he is demonstrating that the patriarchal systems and assumptions that have oppressed Jacqueline her entire life and made the lives of women so unbearable that they have no choice but to become what Jacqueline becomes, which is effectively a kind of horror story monster, right?
Yeah.
It's also fucked them over as well in different ways. When you look at how they're painted, they're not awful. They're just infantile. They're kind of pathetic, you know? Look at, like, her husband, who is the first male character you meet. He's sad and pathetic more than anything. He can't handle the fact that he's living with a woman, that he's chosen a mate who doesn't live up to his standards and his prescriptions. He can't handle that. So he's gone looking for another one, you know, one who is more compliant, one who is more ostensibly fitting to his assumptions of what he needs from a woman. And of course, Jacqueline isn't an idiot. She knows that he'll never be happy because, like a good deal of men, particularly from the era, they didn't ever want a woman or a person in their lives. They wanted a mother substitute who they can have sex with.
I mean, I think as well, though, there's, for me, although it's not explicitly textual when it comes to a husband, there's a strong implication when he confesses his affair that, I mean, there's a strong implication that it's a younger woman as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's definitely a feeling that her husband is fundamentally stuck in a kind of, and you said it earlier, but like almost an infantilized, or at least, you know, I guess in this sense, more kind of teenage mentality. But there's definitely that kind of adolescent, there's a sense that he hasn't grown up beyond adolescence, really. And it's interesting how she remembers, there's an echo of it in her own thoughts where she remembers him as an adolescent and remembers that as the last time that she loved him too, right? Like there's this thing of like, and it's that thing of like, well, okay, so maybe what this should have been is a young romance and the way you parted ways and whatever, but instead you did this other thing and you got married and now you're miserable. But I think it seems to me clear in that, you know, the implication of that sequence is that the woman he's having an affair with is a young woman, because one of the things I love, actually it's one of my favorite sequences of description so far in the book, is where I'm jumping ahead a little bit, the character who does fall in love with her,
Vasi.
Yeah, the way Vasi describes her as a woman, not a girl, and describes her as a woman with a 40-year-old woman's face, and how that's part of what he loves about her is that you know, she has a face that is lived in, I think is the word he uses.
That's it.
And I kind of like, I think the difference between those two male figures and how they see her, and really like her husband doesn't really see her at all. You know, he's projecting onto her and all he sees is his own disappointment that she's not forever 21 because he's mentally locked into that place, you know.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, a common disease. It's not universal, thank goodness, but it is something that you see depressingly often.
Damn common, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
pretty
I'm afraid.
damn common, unfortunately. Yeah, it's fascinating because again, you get echoes of this all the way through. Almost every male character she encounters, other than Vasi, is at the state of arrested development. Even, I mean, she makes that mistake because, of course, she is still a child of patriarchy. She can't help it. She can't help it because, like all of us, she's born into those systems. So even though she has the powers of ostensibly a goddess, she can reshape things around herself. She can reshape her own body if she likes. She goes in search of a man to teach her how to use it. And of course, she looks to, I mean, this is really interesting as well. He looked to the ultra-capitalist dude, someone who is the ultra-materialist, Titus Pettifer, who is a man who is described as like one of the richest men in the world. He controls so much. but you wouldn't. He's so rich that you wouldn't know his name because you don't have to. He doesn't have to be famous. He doesn't have to, like, advertise his fame or power. He is just silent power, and that's what she's after. She needs a lesson in how to use power itself. And of course, when she encounters him, he's no different from her husband. In fact, he's a lot more infantile.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of there's that wild thing about how, like, he's a really clumsy and not very good lover as well.
He's not even a good lover,
husband,
right? I mean, my God, and this is another thing I love. This is, again, it's this arc. I mean, we spoke about this when we did Weave World, but the way his female characters have sexuality without being sexualized. Without being sexualized from a sort of male gaze. They have sex because they like it, because they want to have it, or because it's theirs to utilize. It's theirs to exercise how they wish. And Jacqueline has that. Having escaped the bonds of the domestic sphere, Jacqueline has that. And it's quite incredible.
And it's a thing, isn't it? Because you're right, we talked about it in Weave World. Again, I think Imagica is the other text that does some incredible work on that score. But I mean, how depressing is it that we're sitting here in 2024 and just that fact still feels kind of revolutionary?
Yeah. I mean, we mentioned this before we came on, didn't we, Kayleigh? That, yeah, it is true. That it is still a thing. I mean, this whole story for me is completely revolutionary. It's as we mentioned earlier, there are now writers who are writing in Barker's legacy, of course, who have taken on these tropes and forms and subjects and whatnot. But it does still feel revolutionary to me to have a horror story, a mainstream horror story about a working class woman who discovers power. Discovers agency. But what's really interesting is, even with that power, he doesn't discover identity. He doesn't discover something that can make her whole. And that's true of everyone in this story.
Yeah, there's like I don't know how much of, like, my own experience I sort of, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Read into the story anyway. With like the power she has, there was a line in here that made me think of the entire story as like a gender reversal, like the stereotype or whatever of gender roles in a relationship. And then also, like, if you're in an abusive relationship, because a lot of these guys that she's interacting with, at best they're talking down to her, not respecting her wishes, and then at worst they're violent or whatever. And there's a line, I think it's when she's with Vasi and she's showing him delicately what she can do, like by pulling out specific hairs from his head and stuff. And he says, demonstration of her power, she gave it freely without malice, but I would have been a fool not to have read warning into it. And that made me think about obviously I'm a woman. I've had some good and bad experiences in life, and I have been around men where they haven't outright threatened me, but they've let me know that not with supernatural powers, but they could rearrange my face if they wanted to.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, and I just thought it's funny how these guys are sort of like regarding her as monstrous because she has that ability, but that is just on average the physical power that men have over women.
Right.
So that's kind of how I was reading it, is that she's kind of taken on sort of a different, like the unexpected role for a woman in any given interaction with a man.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? What's really interesting that I want to pick up on what you said there as well. It's so telling that from his perspective, he says that line that you said. He only a fool would fail to notice the threat, whatever the exact phrase is. Like, I think what I love about that is, I mean, I think you're right, and I think it's a fascinating point about the power dynamic and the inversion that is there. But I also think, as I think about that scene from her perspective, which we don't get because it's not told from her perspective, I'm not sure she did necessarily mean it as a threat. I think she probably was just demonstrating her power to this guy because he fucking asked. You want to know what I can do? Well, what's the most gentle way I can demonstrate the ability that I have? I could pluck a couple of hairs out and see. Yeah. And he can't help but interpret that as a threat. And I think that speaks to the wider point, George, that you've kind of been talking about, where it's like, and it's why the end of the story is very interesting as well. But the whole shape of her narrative arc is like, you know, she does have this power. It does put her in this position. I mean, outside of all other people, as well as outside of traditional sort of gender balance, but also ultimately, she's still trapped by the wider structure of patriarchy that weighs on everybody, male and female alike. And that, for me, that line could be read as that imposition, that weight of patriarchy, because that's his internalized patriarchy. Someone has physical power over me, therefore they must be a threat. Therefore, them demonstrating that to me makes them a threat. Even though, as I say, in this circumstance, it seems to me like you literally fucking asked her to do it. You literally, you wanted to know. She showed you in the most delicate way she could, and you see that as a threat because you can't help it, because you're programmed to think that way, because that's, you know what I mean? That's the and that goes to what you're saying about patriarchy fucking up men as well as women. Men cannot be powerless. If someone is physically stronger than us, then ergo they must be a threat.
That's it. And she's a woman, right? She's a woman. So she is, by her very nature, she is the splinter in the flank of patriarchy. It doesn't matter how gentle she is. It doesn't matter. She is the aberration here in this system, in this world. And it's something that's very subtle in the story. You feel it all the way through. And so does she. There is this undercurrent of dissatisfaction, of irritation all the way through. The men she encounters, doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter how they regard her, do not know how to react to her. Even Vasi loves her. Vasi sincerely loves her in a way that's very difficult to quantify, because he sees her as almost like a goddess figure, but also as a woman, as a person. You know, there's a lot of duality and complexity going on in the way Vasi relates to her. I mean, he abandons his life for her, of course. He becomes basically a supplicant, a pilgrim, trying to find her, and he gives up everything. He gives up every relationship. He abandons his career and everything to find her and to be with her in the most ultimate and intimate way imaginable. But throughout that quest, of course, she is also questing. She is trying to find some place in this system, and doesn't seem to, she just cannot comprehend, because of patriarchy, right? She can't comprehend that there is no place for her, the powerful woman, and also the woman whose power isn't derived from anything within that structure. That's an important point. She's not powerful because she's rich. She's not powerful because she's famous. She's not powerful because of something that's been bequeathed to her by these systems. You know, the kind of prescribed power that we allow women sometimes because, you know, it's ultimately harmless. It can be commodified and therefore can be controlled. Her power is metaphysical. Therefore, it cannot be abided. And certainly not by men, and certainly not by powerful men. Titus, look at what happens to Titus in her company. He can't abide her existence. He can't abide her existence because the fact of her is enough to shatter everything he has built his power base on and his identity on. He literally can't exist without her. So he tries to, and the book is, the story makes this absolutely plain. His suicide isn't a suicide. It is in its own peculiar way, and excuse me for the word, but it's an act of rape, his suicide. He is trying to force her.
Yeah, he's trying to exert control,
Yeah, he's trying to exert control in the most ultimate way possible. And the only way he can do it ultimately is by being violent towards her and dismissive.
Yeah, I thought that the sort of like his arc, like through their relationship, was really interesting, because in the beginning she has to say barely anything to get him to have an affair. She just has to sort of put her sexuality on the table, and that's then job done. And I thought that it was interesting that he doesn't recognize that as a power that a woman has over him. But then later on, when he realizes that she actually literally has a power that makes her stronger, he he suddenly views himself as like a sadomasochist.
Yeah,
and I thought that was so interesting that like a man who realizes that the woman in the dynamic is more powerful, and suddenly that makes him masochistic. And I thought that was just so interesting. And I did like his ending though.
Yes.
Oh yeah, it's great, isn't it? I mean, there's a lovely little detail where like he tries to disempower her throughout in many subtle ways. Like he won't use her name.
Yeah,
he calls her Jay. He refuses to use her name because he needs that's his way, isn't it? That's Titus Pettifer. That's what he's emblematic of. He's emblematic of very male control in a capitalist system, in a patriarchal capitalist system. And the only way he can exert his power over someone like Jacqueline is in little subtle petty ways like that. And he doesn't even, the funny thing is, I don't think he realizes he's doing it. This is not a conscious calculation in his mind. He's not thinking, oh, I have to control her some way. I have to demean her some way. I have to exert myself some way. It's just natural for him. It's just the way he is. And that's the saddest commentary of all. And when he realizes that there is no way he can control this, there's no way he can even comprehend this, it's something entirely outside of his sphere, what happens to him? He can't abide it to such a degree that he doesn't want to exist anymore. And his last act is an act of suicidal control.
But you're right as well. It still becomes the control is the important element. He must force her, because he doesn't kill himself, right?
No.
He must force her to kill him, because then at least as he dies, he's re-exerting that control because he's pushed her to it. And I love how she realizes that too. And I love how that whole scene, because we get to see that scene from her perspective. And I love how she resists and resists and resists. And I also love how it plays out ultimately, because I agree with you, Kayleigh, it's the perfect end for him. But also I love how she finds a way to sort of fulfill his wish, but actually no, she does it for herself.
Yeah. And also, I mean, she does. She doesn't kill him either.
But exactly, that's the point. Yeah.
You know, she leaves him in a state of disgrace. Ultimately, a state of disgrace and debasement.
There's also, and I really want to pick up on this because it's really important as well. And I'll say this without going into graphic detail. You can read the book if you want, because it's Barker. He doesn't shy away from the graphic detail. But one of the things that I think it's just a quintessential bit of Barker writing, and it's just an example of how the intelligence of the man, whether that's instinctive or calculated, infuses everything he does in a short story. It's the fact that, and again, this is about a small moment that echoes a larger moment, right? As above, so below. The fact that the real pivot point in their relationship is when she exerts her power over Titus, and when she does that, which he's asked her to do, all she does with it is try to show him how to be tender, and also try to show him how to be a decent lover. And from that point on, he's freaked. You know, he is emasculated, he is angry, and it's like, that is so, I mean, it's brilliant because it makes perfect sense in the fiction, right? It makes sense what we know of Jacqueline, that is her motivation. She would try and do that in that moment. Nothing rings false, nothing feels forced. At the same time, the symbolism of it is just incredible. I mean, it's not subtle, right? But it's really powerful. It resonates so strongly. And I think that's the thing about Barker that gets me. Like, it's his ability to marry these gigantic, like, you know, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with this short story? Okay, let's do patriarchy. Let's just do patriarchy in 40 pages. Okay, cool.
I don't even use that word in his head.
Right.
You know, I think what he did was he sat there and he thought, what if a woman had power? You know, that's it. What happened if a normal woman, had power over the men in her life?
Yeah.
A power they couldn't understand, they couldn't cope with, they could not even conceive of. And just let's play with that. Let's throw her into these different situations and see what happens, you know? And it just becomes, I mean, implicit within that, obviously, is this much wider set of resonances which escalate and escalate and swell and swell it's such a complex story, this one. I mean, the one it reminds me of in those terms is, of course, In the Hills, the Cities, which we discussed earlier. Sure. This is the feminist equivalent of In the Hills, the Cities in many respects. It's the commentary on what it is to be a gay man in the 1980s, UK, Europe, etc. This is what it is to be a woman.
Yeah, I'm wondering if he didn't feel the need to give a reason that she has this power, because he was just sort of reflecting maybe that it's assumed that men have power.
Yeah.
And there doesn't need to be a reason,
Yeah, I think that's largely. I think also, like, if there were an explanation, it would have diminished it somehow. And whenever there is an explanation for this kind of power, it's always given, isn't it? It's always somehow, it's either an accident or it's given, it's granted. And that would have diminished it. In fact, that would have altered the commentary of the story profoundly. I like the fact that it's somehow innate to her. And it's born out of this tension, this friction that she has. It's almost like, I mean, you can infer that it's almost like a wellspring of all of the collective frustration that women have experienced, and all the injustice that women have experienced under patriarchy expressing itself through Jacqueline. I mean, I think even that is too much of an explanation.
I mean, I it's interesting you say that. I mean, one of the possible reads of it is that one could posit that it's in this particular universe that Barker's writing in, it's a power that's theoretically available to any woman that Jacqueline has just happened to access through an extraordinary combination of circumstances, right?
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. It's innate. I mean, because you see echoes of this in his later work, of course. There are powers like the menstruum from Weaveworld. Which is this innately female power that only women have access to. Only women have access to it. And it is terrifying to men. It is antithetical to men. But I think this is a prototype, But
I agree with you, Kayleigh. I think the decision, the very clearly conscious decision as well, because bear in mind, as we've all read quite a bit of Barker at this point, like, this is a man who loves the mythology. This is a man who loves an origin myth and loves the kind of... So it's a very deliberate decision on his part, a very deliberate decision to say this is not just, this is not just not mythology, this is unexplained. Because that's not the point.
No. And there's also a commentary there in many respects as well, because that need to explain isn't in and of itself a very male urge. It's a very sort of like a very patriarchal urge, isn't it? It's a way of controlling circumstances. When there's an explanation, there is comprehension, and there are parameters, there is control. And the whole thing about Jacqueline is that she operates outside of parameters once she realizes herself, once she realizes this power. And to give it explanation would have put parameters on it. It would have bounded it somehow, and it makes her just that much more interesting. I mean, by the end of the story, she's almost goddess-like, isn't she? Despite her circumstances.
Yeah, it is interesting what you just said about like the need to explain or whatever. I can't remember. Sorry, George. I've already forgotten the exact thing you said, but it was like the patriarchy and the need to explain. And I was wondering if there's always as much need to explain if it's a man that has the power. Just touching back on that, it just made me think of. There's a book called The Hematophages by Stephen Kozanowski, and it's about a deep space flight crew.
Right.
And I was halfway through the book before I realized that there were no men in this book. Like the entire crew was women, and it was just never spoken about at all. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting choice. And then I asked him about it, and he was like, he's like, would you have asked me where all the women were if all the characters had been male?
Right.
And I was like, do you know, I don't think so.
Nope.
I might have been quietly irked by the fact that maybe there were no women, but honestly, I don't know if I would have noticed as much.
Right, exactly.
And I thought that's and he was like, he's like, I don't know, I just had the idea for the characters, and then I just thought, oh well, that's what I'm doing.
Love it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's really fascinating because that's kind of like the assumptions of patriarchy coming out, isn't it? In all of us, you know, we can't help it. We can't help it because it's ingrained. We can recognize it and we can question it, but
Yeah, I
we
saw
have
it
to
in.
have that ability, you know.
I found of all things that I found like interesting about this conversation and the not the need to explain, but the demand from certain people to have something explained.
Yeah.
Is I noticed it with Doctor Who.
Yes.
I don't watch Doctor Who, but I will never stop laughing about the knee-jerk crying about the Doctor being cast as a woman for the first time ever, when the Doctor could be a three-headed, you know,
right.
snake. Like
They're an alien.
Yeah, like literally could come back at anything as anything, and and then they also said I think one of the characters in that season was disabled as well. So then I heard people saying like, "Oh, well, how many boxes do they need to tick? Like, what? Well, girl, what's next? A black person?" I was like, "Well, actually, I think maybe." But I thought that was like it's like I can't say that when all of a sudden a show like that starts making an effort to diversify the cast, I do notice it, obviously, because if it's been the same for decades, you notice a change. But also, I find it so interesting that certain people who are very sensitive about that, usually white straight guys.
That's true.
That they like, well why? And it's like, does there need to be a reason? It's like whenever you read a gay character in any fiction, and then I've heard people complain, well, there was no point to them being gay though, and it's like, well, does there have to be a point?
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. I mean, I spoke about Mark with this in our Mark Allen Gunnels and I had a chat a little while back, and we spoke about this where that question is aimed all the time, and it doesn't matter how what the intensity or what the frequency of gay characters are in your fiction, or trans characters, or just queer characters in general. You will always get someone asking that or making that observation. I had that about Strange Playgrounds, my first short story collection. And, you know, the ratio of straight to gay characters in that is about 70-30 in favor of straight relationships and characters. But I still got people, and there are still reviews out there now that talk about the apparent prevalence of queer characters in that collection. I'm like, motherfucker, I could have made the whole thing gay if I wanted to. You know?
This might be a slight diversion from the main topic, but I think it's still kind of relevant.
The motif, go for it.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the way the story that Jacqueline Ess ends with with sex, and I've been thinking about this a lot because I don't want to say I'm a prude, but if I'm reading a story and then a sex scene happens, I will, like, even though I'm sat there by myself reading it, I'll like blush, like I get really embarrassed. And I always say that generally speaking, I can't stand sex scenes in books. I just hate them, and I always wish that they weren't there. But thanks to Mark, funnily enough, now that we brought him up, I had like a brief Facebook post conversation with him a few months ago, and it made me realize that because I'm writing reviews all the time, I'm very aware over the last year that most of those authors I'm reviewing are white straight men. White straight cis men specifically. Yes. And I'll keep reviewing books when people send them in, but I've been making a much more concerted effort, thanks to something that Mark said, for my personal reading lists, to make sure that I'm actually seeking out like queer voices and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have found, and this is just sort of going off that conversation you had with Mark was brilliant. And thank you. When you guys were talking about how homophobes basically will reduce gay people to nothing but sex and make out like that for some reason straight sex is normal but gay sex is dirty, and that's all gay people are is oh, you're the bad gays. And I was thinking that because I've diversified my reading list so much, I've read a lot more gay relationships, and funnily enough, I have noticed that I am a lot less uncomfortable with sexy scenes.
Because that will happen.
No, but what I mean is I don't know if this is something I've projected or just something I've picked up on over time, but I just find that love and relationships are depicted in a much lovelier way in general when it's a gay person writing it. And that's probably maybe a really stupid sweeping statement to make, but that's just based on books I've read over the last 3 or 4 months.
It is interesting because there are certain themes and subjects that do come up in queer fiction and queer expressions and art, not necessarily more so than they do in the work of our straight counterparts, but in different ways and with different emphasis. And although sex is not all we are, it's very important to us. Particularly, I find, to gay men, it's very, very important in the way we communicate with one another and the way we connect to one another. There's always been this stereotype that gay men are more sexualized than straight men. We're more hypersexed than straight men. That's actually not true. We just operate in a very male culture where sex is more available and is just it's slightly more casual sometimes. It is the way we communicate. And what I find when I read writing from gay writers is there is this lack of game when it comes to sex. There is this lack of there is just this willingness to go with it, to run with it. I mean, this is something that King has talked about, isn't it? Hasn't it? He's spoken about this himself. He gets a little bit uncomfortable around sex, doesn't he? He gets a little bit uncomfortable around it. He finds it a bit more difficult to talk about in his writing. What you find in King often is that he will describe the lead up to sex and then he will cut and you'll get the aftermath.
I mean, it's interesting to say, because I'm funny enough, I was thinking of circling back, the whole conversation, I was thinking about circling back to like what we were saying earlier on about that, writers from the 80s and how a lot of it feels very exploitative. And I think actually, Kayleigh, your observation, which by the way, I broadly agree with, and I think the reason for it is because I think, if we think back to that thing about that wave of imitation kind of kings that came out in the 80s and the issues they had around writing women. Well, again, it's thinking of the story we're talking about. I think that's because those writers and those, unfortunately, I think for them, those writers' sexuality to a degree is again, it's a product of that patriarchy, that toxic masculinity, whatever you want to call it, that was just endemic in the culture. I mean, it still is, but it was particularly endemic in the culture in the 80s, perhaps. And that reflects in, I think, badly written sex scenes. And I think one of the things about Barker is that the Barker, I mean, actually there aren't, he writes many more sex scenes when you get into the doorstops, right? But actually in Books of Blood, so far at least, there haven't been a huge amount of, so there's been some, but there's not been a massive amount. But I can't help but reflect on the really kind of deliberately grotesque sex scenes in it's Stardust, isn't it? Which are just like, I mean, it's not an unproblematic story, and we talked about that at length in that. I mean, click back on us at the show. We have opinions about Stardust, but whatever he's doing in there, you can't deny it's deliberate, and you can't deny he's trying to make a point about certain things. But when you think about, for me, when I think about the sex scene in The Hills of Cities, one of the things that strikes me about that is, for all that Barker is capable of being graphic when it comes to sex, there's actually a very touching, I think, sex scene. And what's particularly interesting about that to me is it's a very touching kind of sex scene. I was going to call it a love scene, but they don't kind of like each other very much, so you can't really call it a love scene.
It's more of a reconciliation scene, isn't it? It's in the aftermath of a big argument. They don't really, they're not getting on at that point, are they?
But the interesting thing, as a straight male reader, like reading it, it still felt to me to have more kind of heart, if not romanticism, but certainly, something than a lot of straight sex scenes that frankly
it also has great fidelity. It has a great fidelity as well, to be perfectly honest. I mean, that, you know, it is something we do. It you know, it is very often arguments will lead to sex as a means of reconciliation, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a whole Freudian thing going on there as well. You know, where there's anger leading into desire, and there's a whole raft of things to explore there. I mean, here you've got. I mean, it's not really a sex scene as such, is it? It is, but it's even more intimate than that because it's Le Petit Mort, right? It's Eros and Thanatos like mingled together. It's sex as suicide and as something even more profound because they flow together, don't they? They become one and they die in the act of lovemaking.
You know, as I was rereading it, I forgot that that's what the ending was. So when I got to it, I was like, wait a minute. I remember this. Yeah.
And it's a kind of, I mean, there's a real despair in this story, I feel. There's a real despair. Because, Barker will abandon the misanthropy and the nihilism that often like beats beneath the words of these stories in his later novels. He will abandon that almost completely. But here, it's almost like the statement is, these people between them have defied and abandoned the systems, the powers that be, effectively, the power of patriarchy, the history to which they were born, and it can't abide them, and there is no way out. Mm-hmm. So the best they have, even, you know, for Jacqueline, with all of her power, with all of her abilities, is to end in this ultimate act of intimacy. I mean, there's something beautiful about that. There is something very beautiful about that, but it is despairing as well.
Yeah, I felt sad that she reduced herself to, sorry, I'm not very good with words today. What was I trying to say, George? It was from something you said earlier. No, it's gone.
Is it gone?
To me, yeah.
But no, I think I get it. I think I understand what you were going to say, actually, Kayleigh, because he effectively becomes, you know, after all of these explorations and after all of these experiences that she's had, she basically becomes the very thing that patriarchy would condemn her as, which one of the most misogynistic characters condemns her as, at Linden. He calls her a whore, you know, and even when he's dying, even when she's ripping him apart and transforming him, he's still calling her every misogynistic slur under the sun.
Yeah.
She kind of inhabits that at the end, doesn't she? Almost deliberately. It's almost like, I don't know whether it's a surrender or whether it's a flirtation, because it's weird. She operates in this very strange space. Like the men that keep her, the guy Coos who keep her, he's also terrified of her. It's like he's a little supplicant, but also he defies her as well, doesn't he? Because he's told explicitly, if Vasi comes, let him in, and he doesn't.
Yeah. Oh, that's where it was. It was earlier when you said that she's having problems, like sort of moving through the world now, like because there is no place for her with that power, so there isn't anywhere for her to fit in, and that's what she's searching for. And it just felt to me like, at the end, then when she. And it's not but that scene where she's being called a whore and a slut and everything as well. It's like she gives up on carving out a new place for herself and reduces herself to what she's been called. And in general, I wouldn't say like reducing yourself when you're talking about sex work in general, but in this context, it just feels very sad.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I feel about the ending, because I think it's really beautifully written, and the surface level idea is nice, that it's nice that her and Vasi sort of come back together, but I don't know, it just feels like it. Have you heard that phrase, like the genre of film and books that's like good for her, and it's usually like a female story. The ending of this just about stops it being one of those.
I mean, I think you said it earlier, George. For me, like it is. I don't think anyone does nihilism like someone in their 20s, right? I think.
No, right.
I think there's something about that. You know, that late teens, early 20s. No one does nihilism like that. No one does cynicism like that. And I think, again, we've talked at length about Barker's background and his life experience to this point. I think he was still young enough and angry enough, and I say this without judgment. I mean, he had every justification in the world for how he felt. I think he was young enough and angry enough that this probably felt like a romantic ending to him.
Yeah, I've no doubt. And
I think enough of that intent and spirit is there that it feels that way a little bit, even though it isn't. Right? No. We look at
I also read. I mean, this may be reading too far into it, but I also think there's an admonishing element to it as well. I think he's saying to the reader, "Look what you do."
Yeah.
To the male reader in particular, look what you do. This is what you reduce women to, even when they are powerful, even when they are their own entities. This is what you have done. Look at it. Yeah. Look at it. Don't shy away. This is what you do to the women you love.
Right.
By the way, that you proclaim to love. This is what it comes to.
Yeah, it is. But I think that the ending, I think it is romantic, but it's just I'm conflicted because also it's so tragic.
Yeah.
And but then maybe that's the point, because relationships aren't all one thing.
Sure.
No, absolutely. I mean, and Barker, if anything, he never, ever, ever goes for simplicity. If there's a way of complexifying the issue, or rather addressing the complexities that exist within the issue, he does it. He just goes for it every single time. But it is interesting when you read this in context with his later work, because in a lot of his later work there was almost a refutation of this ending. So if you look at, say, Judith in Imagica, her ending is the antithesis of this. It's the antithesis of this. He has a very similar arc to Jacqueline Ess, in that she's a woman who realizes she's a product of, quite literally a product of patriarchy, and realizes that she has power. But in Imagica, Judith creates her own condition at the end. She actually literally abandons the world of men, and for some other condition, some other state that's entirely female and mythological. It's the inversion of what happens here with Jacqueline. And I think you're right, Kit. I think it is the fact that Barker here is a young man. He's an angrier man. He doesn't have any place at this point. You have to bear in mind, when Barker's writing these stories, he's less than nothing. He's got less than nothing. He is so underclass. It is beyond comprehension. He's not employed. He doesn't have anywhere to live. He doesn't have any money. He's literally turning tricks on the streets of London. He lives in a squat. And I think this is his sincere worldview coming through at the time. It's the bitterness that you can't help but experience.
It's an interesting side note, that as well, and it is worth kind of foregrounding that, and I'm glad you mentioned it. That's a fact that actually only came out, I think, comparatively recently in the last few years. In an interview that Barker did, where he did talk about the fact that he had he had done sex work at this point in his life as part of the way of just keeping body and soul together. And I think that context does help inform our understanding as readers of that last scene of Jacqueline's, because I think it does help. I mean, I want to be clear about this. I think it's implicit in the writing, because I think one of the things I wanted to say about this piece, my central thesis about this, is it really does put a stick of dynamite under the idea that any reductive statement like men can't write women, or women can't write men, or any other reductive statement you want to make about one group against another, it's bullshit. What Barker proves with this story is anyone can write anything as long as you come correct. As long as you engage your empathy, as long as you really fucking dig deep.
Yeah.
It's not beyond, it's not forbidden. You won't automatically be shit at it. You just have to fucking pay attention and be really good. Right?
That's it.
Sorry.
Please.
No, go on.
Can I just leading off that, Kit, if I could just circle back round quickly to what I said about I prefer reading love scenes written by queer authors than straight authors, and I didn't mean to say that like straight authors can't write these scenes well. No. Sometimes, but I think that I'm more comfortable with when it's like a gay author or gay characters, because if we're talking about same-sex relationships or scenes like between two women, for example, and it's a gay woman that wrote the book, there is a complete lack of the misogynistic male gaze on a scene like that. So and I think as well, the scenes that I've read that are written by gay men and the characters are men, there's no, because there's not a woman involved in the scene, the same thing applies, I think. Like and I'm not saying that every straight man is misogynistic, but I think like socially we are conditioned to have, we have, all of us have a bit of ingrained misogyny, and I think
it's true.
And then if patriarchal system and everything, and straight men are very hurt by the patriarchy in particular, because it's conditions people to think they've got to be a certain type of man. And being a man means these things, and unfortunately part and parcel of that is objectifying women. So I think that that's just what I just had this epiphany while you were talking then, that maybe that's why I'm more comfortable with queer written sex scenes, because they're about more than boobs.
Right. And actually, if I can circle back to King briefly as well, you say that, because I just remember something else. Because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because George, it's something that's come up in our conversations a few times about King and sex scenes, but I one of the things that's bothered me about it is, and I've been trying to figure out how to articulate this, so I may be about to screw this up. That's a fair warning. I think that there's a nuance to it that I'd ignore, which is I think the sex scenes that King is bad at writing, actually, and that he tends to avoid, are actually loving sex scenes. I think those are the ones he struggles with. I think about the one I always remember is Alan Pagborn, the sheriff, and Polly in Needful Things, and they're clearly in love. And there's a scene they have that's a sex scene, and he's clearly trying, and it's not, it's awkward. It's not. I wouldn't even call it bad. It's just awkward. It's just But
he doesn't like it. That's the interesting thing.
Yeah, but here's the thing.
He doesn't enjoy it.
Here's the nuance, though. Here's the subtlety, though. Except he's really, really fucking good at writing really broken men with really unpleasant sexual urges. He's actually very fucking good at that. If you've ever read Rose Madder, you know what I'm talking about. I was rereading Apt Pupil the other week, and there's a scene in that where the young teenage boy has his first wet dream off the basis of meeting this Nazi war criminal and hearing all these stories. And I'm not going into any detail at all, because I want people to listen to the show, and also if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about, and you're cringing right now. And the thing about that is that what I think where I got to with that, and that was it. It was reading, because I'm reading the book, by the way, I should say this, I'm reading different seasons thinking, I wonder if any of these stories would be suitable for kiddo, and I got to that scene and that people are like, maybe when you're 30. Like, that's not suitable for me now. You just gave me the complete fucking shits. But I think that's what I think's going on there is, I know that King was a big fan of Philip Roth. Now, Philip Roth was the writer who was excoriating in his exposure of the kind of patriarchal toxic male mentality. And he was merciless when he wrote his male characters, predominantly his characters were men. He was merciless in examining that, putting it on the page, and making you squirm, basically. Like, he was really, really good at it. And I know King admired him a great deal. And I feel like King is good at that. And it's something where, as he's older, I think he's less interested in writing about that stuff in general. But certainly when you look at his juvenilia, you look at the first Dark Tower book, there's moments in that where the sexuality stuff comes out, and it's really powerful, and it's kind of ugly, and it's kind of disturbing. And I want to be clear here, I'm not suggesting that King himself is that way. I think it's the reverse. I think King has been in a long, stable, loving relationship he's very happy with. The reason he doesn't like writing those kind of sex scenes is it probably feels almost like cheating or telling tales out of school. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's none of your fucking business, actually.
That's a really good show, actually, Kit, because like there are relationships and sex scenes in the Dark Tower which are actually really good and really beautiful as well. I always think of the ones in Wizard and Glass between Roland and his first love.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
They're great.
I mean, that's the
really
one
great.
To be fair, that's the one time I think King's done romance well. Is Wizard.
Yeah.
And by the way, I say this in full knowledge that there are tons of Stephen King fans out there now throwing things at me metaphorically because they fucking hate Wizard and Glass, and not one of those criticisms because of the romance. There are valid reasons not to love, but I agree with you. I think it's brilliant.
I like Wizard and Glass. I don't know what the thing is.
It's his favourite. He said that on the Talking Scare podcast. Wizard and Glass is his favourite at the Dark Towers. I love it. I think it's fantastic.
I really like it. I don't know what the thing is with it. I don't know why the hatred, but we'll talk about that again.
We'll do it.
We'll get onto I'm sure at some point we're going to do the Dark Tower, right?
Oh God, I think it's inevitable. I think really,
got to do the Dark Tower. I mean,
got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, my God, if you started talking about King.
I know. Sorry, that's my fault. But I do think, like, anyway, yeah. So I just want to say, like, that was my kind of thesis statement on King and sexuality, and it was just, as I say, it was reading that bit in Apt Pupil and thinking simultaneously, thinking, Jesus Christ, how am I supposed to sleep tonight, you bastard? And also thinking like, but that was really good because what I mean by good is insightful.
Yeah.
Like he really got a part of the reason one of the big reasons it's so horrific is because he has got he's crawled right inside the psyche of this really, really fucked up kid. And he's delivered and you're like, oh no, that's, and that rings true. The contours of that thought process rings true. Now I need a shower.
Beyond anything, I think they have ideological differences when it comes to sex as well, just because
I agree.
They're different experiences. Barker's ultimately a libertine, so he doesn't see any need for sex to have an explanation or an alternative reason or anything in his work. It often does because it's because of its nature.
Kayleigh said it earlier though. The secret with Barker and Barker's sexuality is it is shameless.
Yes, it's completely. He's enjoying it as he's writing it.
Absolutely.
Right? He's actually aroused and enjoying it while he's writing it, and that comes through.
All of that, and also he writes sex scenes where the people having sex are also shameless, and that's the thing. Like they experience no shame with each other, whether it's straight or gay. That's not the point. The point is he understands that is possible, and actually, for a writer like King. Who is, and this is, by the way, I'm not suggesting this is about King's psychology. It's about what King wants to write about, because King wants to write stuff that is rooted in the world he sees around him, and in the characters and the people, and in particularly the cells and the prisons that people build for themselves. He's almost required to write about that side of it being in it. You know what I mean? Because that's the world. Whereas, as I say, with Barker, it's he's comes from that, as you say, he's got that different background, he's coming from that different angle, and it is, I think it's a really joyous aspect of his work, even when all the other shit's going down and the fur and other bodily fluids are flying, which they often are in Barker stories. It's great.
I think that I mean, I would actually like to see, even as someone who doesn't really enjoy these kinds of scenes, like I like the shamelessness of it, because I don't know what it is, right? And I wonder how many things I've said already in this podcast people are going to listen to me and think that I'm like I just hate men or whatever. But like I feel like
I'm gay and I hate men. They're pains in the arse, so it's fine.
Yeah, I feel like for some reason there's this pill clutching hypocrisy with usually just homophobic straight people, not all straight people, where like it goes back to like the bad gays, and I'm not like the bad gays. I'm a nice puritanical God-fearing
good
like
ones, yeah.
and I just think, well, like, isn't it like, don't most people have sex for fun though, like that primarily, and shamelessly when they're doing it, and it's it's a good time, can be had by all. And I just think like this idea of when people make these like weird arguments to try and stamp out gay voices in the arts, and like they make it all about sex and stuff, they're acting as if everyone's doing like that stupid biblical thing of like, oh, it's a man and a woman, and it's pure because it's out of love. And I'm just like, well, if you actually know the Bible, the act of sex is specifically, if you're talking about like a man and a woman and that argument, it's specifically for baby making. So nobody, married or not, should be having sex at all unless they're trying to make a baby. So like, I don't understand the weird fear of actually just being honest about this side of humanity in literature.
I think you've just hit it. I think it's that word honesty, Kayleigh. I think you've just hit the nail completely on the head. Barker's got this real thing in his craw, and he's absolutely right as a writer about fidelity, sincerity, and honesty. He wants to explore things that he feels are true, and he's not going to shortchange the reader by pretending things don't exist or that the reader isn't reacting in this particular way to this particular phenomenon. And sex is part of that. Sex is part of that. He acknowledges that sex is a primary drive for the vast, not everyone, but the vast majority of human beings, and that the vast majority of human beings seek it out and enjoy it. Women, men, whatever your identity, whatever your sex, whatever your gender, or most human beings enjoy it, and we use it in various different ways, as in various different forms of communication and connection. And what's revolutionary about Barker is not just the fact that he writes queer sexuality, but it's the fact that he writes female sexuality. I mean, this even in the 1980s in mainstream fiction, the notion that women enjoy sex and can actively seek out sex of their own, that it can be
we're allowed.
Right, you're allowed to do that, right? And that it can be throwaway as well, right? That it's not just about bagging a husband, or it's not just about security or whatever, that it can be just for the sake of the physical pleasure and connection. Was revolutionary.
Like the key though, I mean, and I feel like an idiot for not thinking of this earlier, but like for me, like the great example of that is, again, going back to Imagica and Judith, it's the fact that there are sex scenes written in Imagica from the woman's point of view.
Right.
Like, as simple a decision as that, right? Because if you think about, like, I guarantee you, if you want to start, because we've all read books and got to a sex scene and gone like, oh my God, right? I guarantee you 99% of those sex scenes have been written from the male point of view, right? That's part of the problem, like, because it's like they're not even able to see the women as like actual functioning human beings with nerve endings and shit and their own interiority and personalities and lives, like none of that. Like, and again, that's where you're talking earlier, like Kayleigh, about like that objectification thing, right? Like it's so clear when a sex scene's been written by a straight man, and he's not really writing the scene. This is not really about the characters. This is some kind of fantasy wish fulfillment, brain porn, whatever you want to call it. And by the way, I'm not necessarily even judging that. Whatever you want to do in your own time is fine, but I don't necessarily particularly want to read it. And also, it's the fact that Barker, talking about revolutionary, writing just says, I'm going to write this sex scene from the point of view of the woman.
Right? It's like revolutionary, right?
Yeah, that's quite ballsy for a man to do. Because especially if people do that now in this day, people are so raring to go on the internet to like rip it to shreds.
Yeah, of course they are.
I mean,
sorry, go on.
No, go please.
I was going to say, I do. If I read a book written by a man now and there's something sexy or something about, like, I do try to cut guys a bit of slack. It obviously depends. If it's like grossly misogynistic and ridiculous, I'll be like, oh my God. But I do try to cut guys a bit of slack if there's maybe like a slight physical inaccuracy or something, because like there are plenty of women that don't understand like 100% of their own body, so I don't expect men to be able, like, I'm not gonna like tear a guy down for trying it, but it depends on the intention in the scene for me, like why it's so and I'm sure that there are women that have reduced men the same way in sex scenes, where like I'm sure lots of male characters are written that's all they want, and that they
honestly there is a thriving sub industry of it's like same-sex porn, but it's written by women for women, it's like Amazon and whatnot, and it's mostly like supposed to be gay men in these stories. It's hilarious. A lot of the time,
I'm so intrigued.
It's frigging hilarious how bad, how inaccurate it is. There's a lot of that, and it's hilarious. It's the entire sub industry It's an entire sub industry, and I shouldn't have used the word sub, really, should I? But
well, I'm sure it's also a dom industry, but I think
that too.
I mean, the thing is about that as well. Like, again, in the abstract, I'm not racing. I'm not racing to my kid to pick it up. Exactly, no judgment. Like, that's fine. Like, whatever.
If that's what you enjoy,
exactly,
no judgment whatsoever. And if people get a buzz out of writing and reading it, no problem.
I mean, that's the thing, right, as well. It's like, and I think it's one of those things about, and I've been thinking about this for a while as well, and I'm going to try and speak carefully around the subject, because I don't want to give the wrong impression. Like, but I think that one of the things I love about Books of Blood, and this might sound like a weird thing to say about, arguably one of the most influential single author short horror collections of all time, right? One of the all-time greats, and that is notoriously bloody and violent and visceral and what have you. But one of the things I've always loved about all of Barker's work, no matter how nasty he gets, is there is always a sense of play.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, at its heart, there is a sense of play. And I think, like, for me, I was talking earlier about coming correct. Like, I don't think as a writer you need to fear writing characters whose perspectives are different from yours. I don't think that's something you should be afraid of doing. I think you should go to it with respect. I think you should do your research. I think you should come correct. And I think you should be open to hearing criticism. But I don't think you should be afraid. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think you should feel fear, and I don't think you should feel like it's not allowed, or you should. No. None of that.
No, absolutely. It's the exercise of imagination, isn't it? It's what develops empathy, ultimately.
Well, that's it.
You need to be able to do it, I would say.
At its best,
need to be able to do it.
I genuinely think at its best, fiction writing, and absolutely horror fiction writing, maybe especially horror fiction writing, at its best is an act of radical empathy. If it's going to fucking work at all.
Yeah, I agree, because in order for it to work, because you're often writing situations and characters that are so extreme. If you can't get a grasp on how those characters are feeling and thinking in that moment, in that situation, then you're not going to sell it, are you?
No, that's right.
But I do. Sorry, you can always find people in the demographic that you're writing to read for you as well.
Right. Yeah.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Totally. I mean, that's another thing with King, really, and he's acknowledged this in that he basically, he basically stopped writing queer characters after a while.
Oh, what?
He wasn't that great.
I mean, weirdly, I think the best queer character he wrote was actually, I mean, it's not a big list, admittedly, but I think he did. I think in Insomnia, he kind of finally cracked it.
Insomnia wasn't too bad, actually. Insomnia was all right. It's when you go back to like some of the earlier stuff and he's having a crack at it, and it's like, stop it.
But I also know that Insomnia, I don't think it's any coincidence that it's two very elderly gentlemen, one of whom is gay, but neither of whom are really interested in sex anymore. Like,
So he's very cleverly, very cannily written that, hasn't he?
He kind of takes the stuff that might cause him problems off the table.
Yeah, he's basically taken away a lot of the more difficult stuff for straight male writers to write, which is amusing.
I wholeheartly believe that I have read a few King books with characters and I thought, oh no. But I really believe that he's he seems like a nice liberal person. Like, I really don't believe that he's a bigot at all. I think that
he's very decent.
Yeah,
very decent.
Well, I think everything is well intentioned and an effort to be more diverse, but he's gone a bit awry sometimes. But it always comes down to intention for me, because he's not the only writer I've read where he's written outside of his demographic and it's all gone a little bit tits up. But it's always about context when I read stuff like that. I think that most reasonable people won't go on a witch hunt if someone has done something like politically incorrect, as like if they really didn't know, like if they were if the intention was what I mean. I'm sorry.
There's no harm. There's no harm. It's
here's the thing about here's the thing about King, and it actually applies to King and race as well. There's a critique. There's been critiques of King's treatment of race, especially in his sort of early to mid career. He's addressed that and he's spoken about it, and I think he writes better black characters now than he did, in his 30s and 40s. But I also think the thing about King is, and actually saying that out loud, that kind of typifies it. He's clearly, it's that his heart's in the right place. He's clearly trying, but B, he gets better. He listens to criticism. He improves. Like that to me is that no one's expected to come out all guns blazing, knowing all the answers and producing perfect art, as if such a thing would even exist. Right. And if we'd even want to engage with it, if it did, because it'd be fucking boring, right? Like the edges, the jagged edges. I mean, we're horror readers and horror writers, right? The jagged edges, that's where we fucking live, right? That's where the interesting stuff is. Well, occasionally stuff's going to get caught in a jagged edge, stuff's going to bleed, stuff's going to go where you're not expecting it, and that's part of the risk factor, right? I mean, Ramsey Campbell, no less than Ramsey Campbell said, horror is the one genre where it is sometimes required to go too far.
Absolutely, yeah. And that goes ideologically as well, of course. I mean, if you are writing a racist character, for example, you need to be able to write that racist character with fidelity. And that includes all the awful things that they would think and they would feel. And those characters have to feel them as though they are not awful. Do you know what I mean? Because to them, it's correct, it's true, it's moral or whatever. And they also have to be able, I mean, this is a contentious point in horror fiction at the moment, but those characters have to be able, certainly internally, to use things like the epithets and whatnot, because that's how they think. Yep. That is how they think. That if you are going to tackle the racism, you need to be able to portray it with fidelity, don't you?
Here's what I'll say on that. If the purpose of your fiction, and if you're looking to read fiction, if your purpose is a form of escapism, if you're primarily writing your fiction, or if you're primarily reading fiction because actually what you want to do is go to a better, less complicated, fluffier world and run around with, then fine. You can write that kind of fiction, you can read that kind of fiction, that exists, that is for you, that is fine, and you go with all of my blessing in the world, because life's short, do what makes you happy, right? If you want to write and read fiction that engages with the fucking real world, and deals with real world issues, you're going to get some dirt under your fingernails. I think you have to. But the point is, again, even with that, you come correct, because here's the thing. I don't know about you guys, but I haven't done as much reading this year as Kayleigh's done in the last 2 months, right? But and I don't want to put you on the spot with this, Kayleigh, but I'm willing to bet that you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You can kind of tell, can't you, when someone's coming from a point of view of like, this is a vile character, and when someone's coming from a point of view of like, yeah, this is kind of sneakily kind of cool, right? Check this guy out. Like,
totally.
Yeah, like you can tell.
It happens very rarely, but there have been a handful of books that I just haven't reviewed. Yeah. And a promise I made to myself when I set the site up, because I actually have come up against people that are telling me I shouldn't be writing reviews because I'm an author. Right. And I'm also an avid reader, and I want to promote stuff. So even if I have critiques, I try and be really honest in my reviews. But if I come up against a book where there's something in there that is where I feel like it's very clear that it's coming from a mean-spirited place on the side of the author, I just won't comment on it, because I don't want to get into a political debate on Goodreads.
Because again, life's too short.
Yeah, that's wise. I think that's really wise.
But I read a couple of things where I thought, oh God, I can feel how the author feels about this, and some things are a matter of opinion, and then some things are just wrong.
Totally.
Absolutely,
totally.
And then you get the flip side of it. I mean, to pick a book that we've discussed, well, actually, and that George and I have discussed a couple of times now. But and then you take something like Exquisite Corpse, which on paper, firstly, no female characters at all. Not a single female character on screen, as it were, at any moment. I think one of the characters names their mother at one point, and that's it. That's the extent. All the characters are male. All the characters that have any interiority that we meet are male and gay. including the 2 fucking serial killers. Like, that book is genuinely one of the most disturbing things I've ever read, and it contains things that if you described it on paper without the context of the book, I'd probably be like, I'm never fucking reading that, and I don't even understand why it got written. But when you read it, right, you fucking get it, because again, you get it, right? You know, there's no question in my mind about where Billy Martin was come from when he sat down and wrote that. Like, that fucking book. Oh my god.
I totally. If I'd read the synopsis, I wouldn't have bought it. And I've mentioned before, I never read the synopsis of a book. Like, I like to pick stuff up just purely on the cover or on recommendations or whatever. Yeah. And I bought Exquisite Corpse because I inferred from the title that it was about zombies.
Oh wow.
Quite the surprise I had.
I can imagine it was. And you know, wow, you went into that book blind, not knowing anything.
Do you know which authors I'd been reading? Up until that point, I had read Roald Dahl, Anne Rice, and Stephen King. So that was.
You weren't quite. I mean, admittedly, you knew a little bit about New Orleans from Anne Rice, but you weren't quite ready.
Trial by fire.
I was picturing frilly collared vampires, you know, flouncing around being their best selves.
Yeah.
And then I didn't even know that this type of horror existed. Yeah. Like when I it was a long time ago that I picked that up. So. Right.
Wow. But I mean, but a life changer, right? I mean, I think certainly for me, I think I was probably, from the sounds of things, slightly older than you, Kelly, when I picked it up, but not much. I think I was in my very early 20s, like you, completely blind, and I just thought, oh, it looks like a fun horror. I think the nearest I got was like, oh, this might be a bit kind of like Silence of the Lambs, because I really liked Red Dragon, and I really liked Silence of the Lambs. So I thought, well, I think I'd read the back cover and I thought, oh, it sounds a bit like it might be a bit Silence of the Lambs.
And it's like era of publication as well. So it makes sense to assume that it would be like that, right? Almost like a procedural, you know, like a profiling drama or something.
But let's be honest, like, there's nothing's going to prepare you for that fucking book, man.
You could know everything about it. You could know every plot detail, and it still wouldn't prepare you for what it's like.
It still jumps out at you from the alleyway and smacks you around the head.
No amount of description of that book can actually do the emotional weight of it justice, because that book is the first book that I can remember closing and thinking, wow, that was about something. Yeah. And obviously every book is about something, but I really felt it. Felt it with that one.
Yeah. But this is it, right?
It's doors of perception blowing off. Right. Brilliant. You know, just game changing. Everything changing. But the revelation that you do this.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm driving at. That's why I picked it up, and that's why, you know, in relation to the story we've been talking about tonight, and the Books of Blood in general, it's like, it's about, and you know. It's about when you come correct. Like, Billy Martin came correct on that book, you know? Yeah. Like, everything about that is authentic. The characters scream at you. They are so real, you know? And the reason that book feels so heavy, because you could write that same set of plot events, and if the prose was flat and the characters weren't real, including the serial killers, by the way, that's quite an important, obviously, aspect, the interiority of the serial killers. And it would just be unreadable garbage. Like, it would be dreck.
Totally. It would either be like pornography, or it would be, but it's not. It's something so profound. I mean, it troubles me, that book. I read it once a year, every year, and it troubles the hell out of me every single time.
I don't know how you do that. I forced myself to reread it when we did the podcast, and I didn't even reread it for our Hanover article, because I'd read it recently enough for the podcast, and I couldn't put myself through it again. I couldn't deal with the final, like, 50 pages of that book. It's just
They are the worst parts. They are the parts that really hit hard.
I'm literally getting a cold sweat talking about it. I'm not even kidding. Like,
yeah, I feel uncomfortable as it races. But I read it once. Right. I read it when I bought it. I read it in a state of shock for the entire time.
Yep.
And then at the end thought, well, that wasn't zombies. But I imagine writing something so powerful that, like, I don't know, like 15 years later, a couple of people who have gone out of their way to not reread it, talking about it on a podcast, it will forever have a place on my shelf. I will never get rid of my copy. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to read it again.
Yeah, I get that. I totally get that. It's harrowing. Yeah,
but it's amazing. And like Kit said earlier, I have read a lot this year so far, especially, but I do read a lot, and for that reason I forget quite a lot of the books I've read. There's only so much room in my brain, and I need a good portion of it for snacks and stuff.
Yeah, of course.
But books that have, like, a book like that I read one time, and I can remember. I feel like I could write a brief overview of the plot points and stuff still. I'd love to be that talented. Like,
Jesus, it's the stuff that troubles me, like that it arouses. Like, I found Andrew Compton really attractive, and I was like, that's wrong. That's wrong. What is wrong with you? Yeah. The man is like pure evil, he's pure unadulterated evil. But yeah, and it's consistent as well. It happens every time I read it.
Yeah.
Well, that's good character work, though, because nobody is just one. Well, hardly. I'm sure maybe there are the odd few anomalies, but most people are very layered, and even the most heinous people will have, something redeeming in them. It's I think that's it's bizarre, isn't it? But
No, but I mean, we talked about when we talked about the book, George, and you and I, but like, I still am slightly disturbed by how much I over-identify with and love Lucas, who is a really, really unpleasant guy. But really unpleasant character, but really unpleasant guy. But I love him because it's his. I mean, with Lucas, it's his anger. And actually, that whole. I mean, that's a big part of my kind of life lesson from Exquisite Corpse is, like, use your anger. Because it's one of the angriest books I've ever read, and the fury, and it's embodied in Lucas, of course. It's embodied. It is. It is. It's a furious book. It's a furious. It is. Yeah. It's a call to arms book. That one. Exactly. Really is. And there is a couple of stories in the Books of Blood that are like that, and I think this is one. To be honest, I agree. I think Jacqueline Ess is one of them. How do you always manage to do that, George? You got us back. Very good. I'm very well played, sir. I'm very good at segues. Well, I've got to wrangle Jack and Elliot on the Hannibal podcast. That's true, I've learned really, really well. I've got the techniques down now. Kayleigh and I are like soft soap compared to those. Absolutely. But it's another one, isn't it? It's another. I mean, like, not just a brilliantly written story, not just a revolutionary horror story, but another manifesto. This another story in a mainstream genre that in the 1980s was largely popular for its entertainment value. Just saying so much. But again, can I ask a question? Like, sure.
Sorry, because you guys know a lot more about Clive Barker than I do, because I know very little about Clive Barker, the man.
Know everything about Clive Barker. I'm not entirely convinced that Clive Barker isn't actually being held prisoner in George's garage. Gotta be honest with you. Real talk. If I found that out, I wouldn't be surprised. Would not be surprised.
To be honest, I feel like we'd forgive you, George.
Totally.
I feel like I don't know what Clive Barker looks like. I've never looked at a picture of him, but I just feel like he's sexy for some reason.
I mean, he's in his
question.
Oh, right. Okay.
He's in his 70s now. He's just turned 70, but he was a really handsome guy. He was very handsome. I mean that was That was one of the things that people always bloody mentioned in the interviews with him, throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. It's like, he's the sexy guy of horror,
I mean, for me with Barker, like if you imagine like Tim Roth in his 20s, but about 10 times hotter, that's what Barker looks like or looked like. Yeah, he was a good looking man.
Pretty sexy guy, and like the way because he's lived in he came from Liverpool originally, then moved to LA, and he's lived in LA for so long that he's got this like he kind of talk like this. It's not quite English and it's not quite American. It's all in the back of the throat, a very strange, very particular way of speaking. He was. I mean, he's getting on now, so he's not quite as sexy as he used to be. But yeah, he was pretty hot during his day.
I'm pretty sure he just let Clive out of the garage to say that. By the way, I don't think that was good. But anyway, I believe you had a question, Kayleigh. You were trying to get.
Yeah, sorry, Kayleigh.
That's okay. The question I was actually going to ask was.
I think he's not sexy. Sorry, he's not. Sorry, Steve.
When Clive Barker first was publishing, was he out? Like, did the public know? Because I'm so fascinated by because right at the beginning of the podcast we said this just wasn't being written.
Yeah,
like these viewpoints weren't explored.
I mean, like to be out in the 1980s was a really was a big deal. It was a big deal. And to be out in the horror genre in the 1980s was an even bigger deal. Yeah, he was.
He was. Wow.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me because we still live in a day and age where certain people are going to find it harder to get into mainstream publishing. So I just who would dare not publish Clive Barker? But I'm just, you know what I mean, though, like with the amount of prejudice and everything, especially in the 80s, I find it
It's a minor miracle. I mean, like the circumstances that had him A, get published in the first place, and B, land on Stephen King's desk where he got that brilliant which basically like founded his career. It shunted him into the mainstream. It's just this happy little chain of accidents, this contingency of accidents.
The other person we must name check actually, though, if we're talking about early Barker as well, is Ramsey Campbell, who was an early champion of Clive's work as well.
Yeah. Well, he appeared at Clive's school.
That's right.
Yeah. Schoolboy, and did this talk about writing and whatnot, and that really kind of supercharged Clive as I think he was like 11 or 12 to like get in on this, to become a writer. So
but again, Ramsey was a champion of Clive in the 80s when he was establishing himself, when, as you say, like the wider culture was what it was. And absolutely. I think again, we talked about horror as a genre, and I think every community has its issues, every community has its bad faith actors and so forth. But I think we've talked before about how the horror community does feel, I would say, on aggregate, one of the most welcoming creative communities out there. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's significant that Barker had those champions in Ramsey Campbell and in Stephen King in the 80s, and that definitely at a time when there was the wider culture.
And their legacy to speak on your behalf, which, you know what, all fair dues, a gay guy, an openly gay guy, would have needed at that time.
And what I like about it is, again, Campbell's spoken about this a lot, King less so in recent years, but the impression you get very strongly from both those men, it's like it was because they read the books of blood and it fucking blew their heads off. Because it's awesome. You know what I mean? Like, this is not about like meet my gay friend bullshit. This is just like read this. It is mind blowing.
Yeah, and as a result of those decisions, of course, as we spoke about earlier, this opened the floodgates, not just for Clive, but it allowed Clive to burst off all the seals, to break open all of the doorway to the forbidden areas for everyone else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there were gay horror writers writing at the time. There were people like John Saul, for example, but I'm not sure John Saul was even out at that time. Probably not.
Right. No,
and the fiction that he wrote,
his fiction wasn't out, was it? I mean, that's the thing.
Definitely not. I mean, you can see the queer themes in it.
Sure.
If you go back and read it now, he's always writing about outsiders thrown into these strange situations where they are the alien in whatever situation they're in, and it's like I can sort of see what he's getting at here. But no, his fiction definitely wasn't. It was very sort of like you would recognize it as horror of the 1980s. Effectively, you know, you would recognize it for what it was. So that's another way he was revolutionary, you know, just being out, just being who he is.
Yeah.
He's so influential. It's like everyone that writes would love to be compared to Clive Barker.
Yeah. It's a thrill every single time. Whenever anybody does it, everybody does it to me, obviously, because the influence is so strong. And it's like, I'm very happy with that. I'm very happy with that comparison. But it's just, and see the legacy of that flowering now. Is the most brilliant thing. It's the most brilliant thing. Because as I said, I'm so familiar with Barker's work now that I can see the DNA of it in so much that's out there, and that is a wonderful thing.
I mean, you know, we talk. I mean, a sense of wrapping up as we're talking about this story as well. It does occur to me, like, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Barker as an artist in the 80s is, and again, this will have marked him out just for its unusualness, talking about the milieu of 80s horror. Just the fact that his work was, you know, feminist, and it wasn't it wasn't the defining quality of what it was, because nothing is the defining quality of what he does, because that's the point of Barker. Like, it's all story, and as well as all these other ingredients. But the fact that it was just unabashedly and kind of without blowing its own trumpet about it either, it just is, right, feminist. What I love about that is the implicit challenge that throws down to all the other horror writers. It's like, what's your fucking problem, lads? Do you know what I mean? Like,
guys, come on, you know, for a start, I'm gay. You're supposed to know women better than me, right? Yeah,
right. And this story does feel like that. This story does feel like the kind of the 1980s short horror equivalent of like a glove to the face, right? It's like
there's a couple coming up actually very soon where it's so explicit that it's almost aggressive. Okay. He's basically saying he's basically saying to horror writers of the era, like, come on,
pull your socks up, lads.
pull your socks up. Come on, exactly that. Pull your socks up, please.
And again, I think that's something you can only do when you're that young, and you're that young, you're that hungry, and you're that, you know, you have that level of confidence. I mean, in your own abilities, in your own belief in what you're doing. And I love that about it. I mean, I love, again, I don't know his process, but it just, everything about it feels joyously instinctive.
Yeah, it's very chaotic.
Yeah,
it's very chaotic.
And I will say, like, that is, I think, although they're very, very different artists, complementary in some ways, but obviously very different artists, I do think that is the thread that binds Barker and King together, is that feeling of pure love of story, love of narrative, love of pursuit of narrative. Like, where the fuck am I going with this? You know?
Just following imagination.
Yeah, right? Just chasing rabbits.
The idea, the image, the sentence. Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, it feels so sincere as a result of that you can't help but fall in love with it. You know, you can't help but follow it to its end. Yeah. And it's brilliant. I mean, you know, we say it every single time on these podcasts, but these stories are something else. They are. Yeah. If you've not read them, guys, you've got to read these books. If you like horror, if you understand, if you're interested in like the legacy of horror, like why horror fiction is the way it is now, you've got Barker's one of those guys you've got to read. He's like Lovecraft, or he's like Poe, or like King. You know, you need to understand him, you know.
That is true, but I'm also just going to say this: unlike Lovecraft, this is vivid as fuck now.
Yeah,
I guarantee you pick this book up in 2024, and you're not going to be scratching your head over the language. You're not going to be saying what's a bas relief or an eldritch whatever. You're going to have your fucking mind blown.
What does squamous mean?
Exactly. Like, for me, the genius of Barker is just, it was written in such a passion, in such heat, that that heat is still there. It still burns. It's absolutely incredible. So, and that's, for me, that's the mark of kind of like a true kind of classic, I think.
Yeah, and also does it without feeling preachy.
Oh yeah.
So like Jacqueline Ess, obviously that is that is a feminist story.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like he's going, hey, look, guys, I've women, am I right?
It's not sort of like wagging his finger at the reader, is it? It's not didactic, you know?
Yeah,
and considering how heavy the story is, I mean that's brilliant. That's really clever. That's a very subtle lightness and sleight of hand. That is, it's brilliant, utterly brilliant. Well, guys, thank you so much. That was brilliant. That was so much fun to talk about. Before we go, Kayleigh, do you have anything that you'd like to pimp out?
My last solo release is still The End from Black Ship Books. But for any writers that might be listening or readers that are interested, French Press Publishing have announced an anthology called Strange New Moons that there's currently a Kickstarter for, and it will be opening for submissions, and it'll be werewolf stories.
Oh, hello. Interesting.
I think you meant woo.
Yeah, in retrospect, that was a missed opportunity, Kayleigh. You're right.
It was, yeah, absolutely. Links to everything below, by the way, guys. Kit?
Yeah, firstly, check out The End. It's fucking brilliant. Also, check out Happy Goat Horror, because it's brilliant, even when I'm not on it. As for me...
You're usually on it, Kit.
I am on it. Yeah, a slightly embarrassing amount, but it's really good, even when I'm not. So for me, if you enjoy hearing me discuss these, discussing horror fiction and so forth, you want to read essays in that form, My Life in Horror Volumes 1 and 2 are available. A collection of over 60 essays across the two books, taking in horror influences throughout my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, including, as you'd expect, classics like Stephen King's It, but also including, things you might not immediately expect, like certain world events or Pink Floyd albums and things of that nature. So if you enjoy hearing me talk and you want more exposition from me about influential art of this kind, then check out My Life in Horrors Volume 1 and 2, paperback, hardback, and Kindle. Also go to Ginger Nuts of Horror and read My Life in Horror column there, which has been taken over by the wonderful George Jenny Lee, who's about to probably pimp that out again, and is carrying that legacy forward. If you read nothing else, I mean, read all of it, because it's all brilliant, my stuff and his, but especially read the article that George recently posted concerning Pride 2024. It's actually essential reading. Absolutely fantastic fucking essay.
Oh, thank you, guys.
So yeah, check that out. And I said it. I think I said it on a Facebook post, but just so I know, I've said it to this audience as well. Like, I always knew that you were going to take that column to a whole new fucking level, George. But I could not be prouder that you agreed to do it, because that article was just fantastic, just wonderful work.
Oh, my honor and pleasure.
So that's great. If you want my fiction, there's lots of it at this point. Just go to amazon.co.uk, go to books, then put in Kit Power, and then you'll find my author page there with all my books. If you want to get the paperback, maybe see if you can get it from the original indie press, or a lot of them have their own websites. Black Shuck in particular, who put out the Finite, buy it from them direct, actually, because they make slightly more money if you do that. And we don't really need to buy Jeff Bezos another fucking spaceship, do we? So, or for that matter, you just order them from your local library. They've got ISBNs. That would be amazing. I love seeing my books in the library. It makes me so happy. Lastly, if you want to get something new from me every single week, that new thing might be an episode of a podcast on Bruce Springsteen or James Bond or Sherlock Holmes, or it might be an episode of a podcast with me talking to my daughter about the book we read a couple of weeks ago, or it might be an essay from me, or it might be an excerpt from one of the 2 new novellas that I'm hoping to have coming out later in the year. Patreon.com/kitpower. $1 a month will get you something new from me every single week. And that's me.
Brilliant. Links to all of that below, by the way, guys, as a very, very big block of links there for you. Mine's exactly the same. For myself, guys, you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy, where there are more discussions like this. We're currently doing the Return to Hannibal Digested, in which Elliot Chapman and Jack Graham and myself dissect pretty much every episode of Brian Fuller's Hannibal. because we love it to bits, and the cast are so very pretty, and we can't sort of keep away from it. If you want to read any of my published fiction, if you go to strangeplaygrounds.com, you will find links to all of my short story collections, or like it. If you go to Amazon, type in George Daniel Lee, you'll find my author page, and that has links to all of the anthologies, all the short story collections, and so on. As Kit mentioned, there are currently several articles waiting to be released at the moment in the My Life in Horror series, all very, very different over at gingernutsofhorror.com. Very, very, very proud to have taken that over, Kit, and I'm really enjoying it. It's been fun. It's been really fun, and revelatory as well. There's been stuff that's come up, you know.
Yeah. You learn stuff about yourself. I did tell you. I said, like, if you take this on and you take it seriously, and I know you will, you are going to find some shit out.
Yeah,
hopefully good stuff.
Yeah, good and harrowing. You know, there's been a lot of, there's been a lot of really interesting associations and things coming up. But that's all part and parcel, isn't it? That's loads of fun. Oh, and also, just as an aside, you may have heard me mention this a couple of times, but last year, Kit and I recorded, we actually did a chat for Arrow Films for the Hellraiser UHD and Blu-ray set, The Quartet of Torment. If you go to arrowfilms.com, you'll find it. We are on the Hellbound disc, and it's an hour. It's the featurette Hell is What They Wanted, and it's an hour and 48-minute chat about Hellraiser and Clive Barker and fiction and horror and all sorts of stuff, and it was great fun. And I think for now that's everything from me. There's stuff that I'm dying to tell people about, but I can't.
Yeah,
I'm kind of, you know, it's almost like a, you know, I can't. I'm not allowed to tell you, and it's really annoying. But watch this space, basically. Yeah, it is a watch this space thing. So thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute blast.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us. And yeah, Kayleigh, come back anytime.
Yeah, any time. And if you want to chat about anything, Kayleigh, let us know and we'll set up the chat. It'll be great fun.
Oh, I'll definitely take you up on that. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Cool.